Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Omega Insight. Tonight's topic is about feedback, and I'd like to start with a little parable. Way back when, in the gunslinger days, there was a gentleman called Black Jack Jackson, and he was one of those violent kind of gunslingers. He loved to play poker, and every time he would lose, he would be often the one who would shoot the guy. Like, killing wasn't a big thing for him. He wasn't feeling good one day, so he went to the doctor, and he explained to the doctor all of the symptoms that he was having: continuous headache that seemed to be getting worse, nausea, blurred vision. And so the doctor did all of the tests, the latest tests that they had. As a matter of fact, they had something new called an X-ray machine. So they did the X-ray machine, and after all the tests were said and done, the doctor sat down with Blackjack and very solemnly said, "I hate to report to this, but you see this little spot on the X-ray? That's a brain tumor. It's inoperable, and you're going to be dead in about 6 months." And after Blackjack received that news, he promptly stood up and shot the doctor dead. Then he left and went to go find another doctor. The second doctor did the same thing. He went and did all the tests that he could and ended up with the same diagnosis. And again, Blackjack stood up and shot the doctor dead. This continued on. He would go from doctor to doctor looking for a diagnosis that was something that he wanted to hear, not that it would end up in death. Eventually, he stepped into Doc Peterson's office, and Doc Peterson had heard about Blackjack and heard about the trail of dead doctors behind him, so he naturally did the same test. And when he sat Blackjack down, he showed him the X-ray, and he said, "Yeah, you see this little dark spot right here? Well, it looks something like this bolt," and he had a bolt in his hand. "It looks something like this bolt, and the X-ray machine is kind of new, and it looks kind of like that bolt. But I do see," and he pointed to another section of the X-ray, said, "there's a lot of swelling over here. Do you get a lot of hangovers?" And Blackjack said, "Well, yes, I do." And he said, "Oh, well, that could give you the same effect with the headaches and the nausea and dizziness. Here's some tincture." So he gave him a tonic to take, and he said, "Drink the whole thing before you go to sleep, and this should help you feel better." So Blackjack stood up, shook the doctor's hand. He was so happy. He went home, drank the whole thing, and went peacefully to sleep. The next morning, Blackjack was found dead. Now, typically when I tell this parable, I'll always pause and say, let's consider for a moment, take a questionnaire. Do you believe that Blackjack was killed by Doc Peterson? And that's the question we put out. Do you think that Blackjack actually killed Doc Peterson? Then I go back to the story where an autopsy was performed, and it was discovered that Blackjack's death was indeed the result of an inoperable brain tumor that he was diagnosed 6 months earlier. So it was the original diagnosis that killed him, not the ailment or the tincture that Doc Peterson gave him. Now, there's two morals to this story. The first moral is a teacher knows when a student is ready for the truth. He also knows when the student isn't, so he doesn't give it to him. Common sense is when you see an angry dog, you don't slap it. As a teacher, you must be aware of the state of your students, what their state of mind is. And this is where reticence comes into play. As you know, I like to use the definition of reticence, selective speaking, and I like to add also understanding when to speak and when not to speak. So it's what to say and what not to say, as well as when to say it and when not to say it. Reticence is required for those people who endeavor to be teachers. The search for knowledge is a noble quest, and the wisdom of knowledge is nobler still. Fearing for his life, Doc Peterson knew that Blackjack was near his death. And he didn't tell him. He didn't lie. The dark spot on the X-ray really did look like the nut in his hand, the bolt in his hand, so he didn't really lie. But what he did was he avoided the subject altogether by pointing to something else, the swollen blood vessels. He had wisely, very wisely, administered the diagnosis and gave an appropriate tonic for that ailment, which was correct. So he didn't lie. He simply avoided the big issue, which was causing problems all along, because he knew it was going to cause his death. The second moral is you can refuse to see the truth about yourself, yet you'll still suffer the consequences. Blackjack refused to acknowledge that he had a brain tumor, and still he died of a brain tumor. So common sense is if you cut your hand and refuse to tend to it, you're going to bleed to death. You can operate a car blindfolded, but you're going to cause tremendous damage. Self-knowledge means to learn about ourselves. And it's not exclusive to butterflies and flowers and pretty rainbows. It's not exclusive to that. We, as a human race, love to give compliments. We really do. We love to give compliments, but we're afraid to give feedback. And oftentimes it's because we receive feedback as criticism, or the feedback is loaded with judgment. It's not delivered correctly, and it's got criticism and judgment in it, which changes things, because that means when the person who's giving you feedback with loaded criticism and judgment, they have an expectation. It's not clean and clear. The difference between feedback, there is a great difference between feedback and criticism. Most of us think about what we received as criticism, and the ability to deliver feedback is in direct proportion to the ability to receive feedback. I'll say that again. The ability to deliver feedback is direct proportion to the ability to receive feedback. In other words, if you can't receive feedback, you should not be giving feedback. Criticism, as I said, there's a difference between feedback and criticism. Criticism is destructive. It has an expectation that things should be done differently, and what they should be done is with what the person who is telling you how they should do it. It's filled with judgment. It's tied to emotions. For example, it's like saying clouds are a drab, lifeless white, or grass is a puke green. Criticism serves no one. It doesn't serve anyone when it comes to criticism. Feedback is constructive. It's an observation. It's tied to the spiritual aspect of us, if I could say. There's no emotions involved, no emotions whatsoever. It's factual, simple, like clouds are white, grass is green. That's it. There's no emotion about it. It's just a simple stated fact. Nothing more, nothing less. You call a spade a spade. Feedback serves everyone. Now, to receive feedback, you have to have courage, and to deliver feedback, you also have to have courage. It takes courage to look at yourself with a cold eye, to see yourself from another person's point of view. And to have a full picture of myself, I must receive feedback. In Omega, we talk about this all the time. It's very important to ask for feedback. Hey, what did you think? Can I ask for your feedback? Can you let me know and get an idea of how you're showing up? How did I show up? How did I sound in that presentation? How did that email sound? Do you think my conversation was good? Was my tone of voice appropriate? Could you have the right volume? Like, it could be anything when it comes to feedback, but feedback is not constantly, it's the attempt to get a better understanding of how I see myself, because most of us have a picture in our head and it's not quite accurate of the way we're showing up in life, unless we have feedback, and then we can see what other people are thinking about. Now, as I said this before, it takes courage to deliver feedback, but it also takes wisdom. I mentioned wisdom earlier. The number one reason why people do not receive feedback well is because they're thin-skinned. Thin-skinned is, I mean by reactive. They're emotionally charged. Whenever you give them feedback, they take it as a personal attack. And they don't see any value in it. And they refuse to acknowledge anything other than what's in my house. No, that's not what I did. That's not what I did. No, that's not what I did. That's what they'll say. And they're reactive, so much so that they'll turn around and say, well, you do that. So it's very important to remember that when you're giving feedback, be wary and be wise when you're delivering feedback. Thin-skinned people are very insecure, and as I said, often can be violent and lash out to you and attack you. It's sheer insanity to attempt to give feedback to a thin-skinned person who doesn't ask for it. And even if they do ask for it and you know they're thin-skinned, you must implement wisdom, but also be creative. Perhaps maybe it's not the right time, and you can say, well, thank you, let me think on that, and can I get back to you? So you're not leaving them hanging, but you're not stepping into a volatile situation. Now, how do you determine whether or not the person who's asking you for feedback is thin-skinned? Easy. Listen to them. What are the words they choose? Is their vocabulary filled with blame? Do they complain a lot? Are they quick to find fault in others? Do they take responsibility for themselves, even for the things that don't go right? Do they take responsibility? That's whether or not you can determine you're delivering feedback to a thin-skinned individual. So to deliver feedback is a skill. I have a whole class about delivering feedback and the steps that you go through for feedback, but one must learn to remove your personal judgment. It's very important, and stick to the facts. And above all, remember that feedback is for the one you're giving the feedback to. It's not about you. There's no advice administered. There's no apologies. It's for that individual. They're seeking from you, hey, how did I do? Can you give me some feedback? What they're really asking you to do is hold up a mirror and let them see themselves from another point of view. And this is a great service that we can do for one another. So again, the idea is to remember that when you're asking for feedback, make sure you're open for the feedback and you're not going to react raw. And when we're delivering feedback, the wisdom as well as the feedback, no emotions involved. So thank you for joining me this evening. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a wonderful week and enjoy delivering and receiving feedback. Bye now.